You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.
Okay, in this segment, we're going to take a look at socialism influencing progressive reform. This is the second part, part two. And in this particular segment, we're going to take a look at the significance of women in the workforce. One of the things that they faced were very restrictive and controversial environments. So we're going to appreciate why the progressive reform movement was in essence also a women's movement for change. So let's start out with one of the most important unions that was organized in 1903, and it was known as the Women's Trade Union League, the WTUL. And this was an organization of both working class and more well-off women that formed in 1903 to support the efforts of women to organize labor unions and to eliminate sweatshop conditions. Now, the WTUL played an important role in supporting the massive strikes in the first 2 decades of the 20th century that established some very important unions: the International Lady Garment Workers Union and the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America. They were campaigning for women's suffrage amongst both men and women workers. Now, WTUL was organized in 1903 at the American Federation of Labor Convention, where the WTL spent much of its early years trying to cultivate ties with the American Federation of Labor leadership. By 1907, the WTUL saw its purpose as supporting the AFL and encouraging women's membership in the organization. It also drew on the earlier works of activists in the settlement house movement, such as Jane Addams and Florence Kelley, and budding unions and industries with a large number of women workers, such as the garment industry as well as the textile industry. So when we take a look at the Women's Trade Union League, it was comprised both of upper-class philanthropists and working-class women with experience in organizing unions. Now, an event worth appreciating concerning the immigrant women's experience is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911. Industrial growth affected factory workers most directly because working conditions for women were often dangerous. Family survival required that women and children had to work, often in the lowest paid and the most exploited positions. Women and children worked in poor ventilation, dangerous fumes, open machinery. There was no such thing as safety precautions, and they worked in very unhealthful conditions. So let's appreciate what happened to primarily Jewish immigrant women in New York in 1911 when a fire killed 146 of them that were trapped inside a factory. So let's take a look at the Triangle Fire.
It was late in the afternoon on a beautiful spring Saturday, March 25th, 1911. 4:40 p.m. to be exact, nearly quitting time at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York's Greenwich Village, where 500 workers, mostly young Italian and Jewish women and girls, got ready to collect their pay and go home. Someone dropped a match or a cigarette, and within minutes, the factory, which occupied the top 3 floors of a 10-story building, became an inferno. Fire ladders, which reached only 6 floors, were useless. The fire escape collapsed under the weight of desperate workers trying to escape. One of the doors, it would be reported, was locked. Onlookers out for a weekend stroll in nearby Washington Square Park watched in horror as women leapt to their deaths from upper-story windows, some crashing through the firemen's nets, others hitting the sidewalk with a sickening thud.
It's almost a mirror of what happened in 9/11.
In some ways, it was. The horror of the fire jumping the way they did. It was more intimate, though. You could look into their faces in their last moments, hear them hit the pavement that way, you know.
In the days that followed, family members crowded into a makeshift morgue, trying, sometimes in vain, to identify those they lost among the charred remains. On that day, says researcher Michael Hirsch, all of New York was united in grief.
This fire really shook people up. You know, the city was so guilt-stricken that maybe we were somehow responsible. And it led to all of these reforms that came afterward.
Out of the ashes of the Triangle Fire came new safety and fire regulations, child labor laws, and workmen's compensation. The outpouring of support for working people galvanized the fledgling American labor movement. Frances Perkins, who witnessed the tragedy that awful day and who would go on to become FDR's Secretary of Labor, called it the day the New Deal began. Every year since then, there have been tributes and remembrances, and this year is no exception.
This is the Union Monument to the Triangle victims.
But Michael Hirsch, co-producer of an HBO documentary on the Triangle Fire, worries that memories of that day and its repercussions are fading, like the names on the graves at Mount Zion Cemetery in Queens.
You used to be able to read this, but it's just melting away. And it's almost like a metaphor for the way we're forgetting these people and what they did for us.
For the last 5 years, Hirsch has made it his mission to find the names of all 146 people who died in the fire that day and their stories.
I just felt we owed it to them somehow. So they lost everything, and for them to lose their names as well, that just seemed wrong.
I always remember my dad telling us that he had an aunt who died in the fire, but that is all I remember.
Erica Lansner didn't even know her great-aunt's name until she got a call from Michael Hirsch.
And he said, could you possibly be related to Fanny Lansner, who died in the Triangle Fire? So this is a picture of Fanny from the newspaper article.
Erica Lansner discovered that her 21-year-old Aunt Fanny was a hero that day, saving the lives of many of her co-workers before jumping to her own death.
And just to think of a 21-year-old knowing she had minutes to live and chose to put others ahead of herself is just extraordinary. I feel actually quite proud, to be her descendant.
Essie Bernstein also died in the fire. She was a relative of factory owner Max Blank, who, along with his partner Isaac Harris, was accused of locking the factory door. Some say to keep out union organizers after a bitter strike. Their acquittal by a jury caused outrage then and still rankles some today. In truth, though, says Michael Hirsch, the Blank family suffered too.
The Blank family, they lost more people in the Triangle Fire than any other family. No one really knows this. It's just been kept out of the histories of this.
Why?
I think it's just, you start to mention things like that, you start to humanize these people and start to tell the story differently.
Susan Harris is the granddaughter of Max Blank. Growing up, she says, she knew nothing of the Triangle Fire. Her family moved to California and changed the spelling of their name. When she was a teenager, she came across a book and a name that looked familiar.
I remember turning to my mom when I said, was this Max Blank? Was this my grandfather? And she said, yes, but that happened a long time ago. You don't need to worry about that.
She has spent the last 5 years remembering the fire and its victims by stitching the names of the dead onto pieces of old shirtwaist fabric and handkerchiefs.
The reason I used the shirtwaist pieces is obvious because of the waste factory. And the reason I used the handkerchiefs was because of the loss and the grief.
She calls them prayer flags.
So many people, they blame your family for what happened.
Yeah, I know. I think that if I had lost, my children in the fire, I would have wanted to blame someone as well.
So many lives cut short that day, so many families broken, so many memories lost and found, and so much pain. But also stories of courage and triumph, and that, says Michael Hirsch, is worth remembering.
They didn't set out to be heroes. They weren't like soldiers on the battlefield. They wanted what we all want. They wanted families. They wanted to have a successful life here. They wanted to be Americans. And their sacrifice is the thing that really motivated people to start thinking about doing things differently in this country. So in a way, they are kind of heroes. I look at them that way.
Now, an important woman that we need to appreciate, who's a prominent labor union leader, she was a socialist, she was a feminist, and it's Rose Schneiderman. Now, she was the first of 4 children of a very religious Jewish family. And while her parents worked in the sewing trades in Tsarist Russia, Schneiderman first went to Hebrew school, which was normally reserved for boys, and then to a Russian public school. So in 1890, her family immigrated to New York City's Lower East Side, and her father died in the winter of 1892, leaving the family in poverty. Her mother worked as a seamstress, and of course, trying to keep the family together, but the financial strain forced her to put her children in a Jewish orphanage for some time. So Schneiderman had this experience of living in poverty, of having to deal with a woman-led household. So she left school in 1895, as most children living in poverty do, and she went to work. She started as a cashier in a department store, and then in 1898, she was a lining stitcher in a cap factory in the Lower East Side. So that by 1902, she developed an interest in both radical politics and trade unionism, and in 1903, she began organizing the women in her factory. And when they applied for a charter to the United Cloth Hat and Cap Makers Union, the union told her to come back after they had succeeded in organizing 25 women. They did that within days, and the union then chartered its first women's local. Now, Schneiderman is going to gain wider recognition during a cap makers strike in 1905. And as she ascended into the union ranks, she was elected secretary of her local, and she was a delegate to the New York City Central Labor Union. And this is where she came into contact with the Women's Trade Union League in New York. And the WTUL lent moral and financial support to the organizing of women workers. So she quickly became a very prominent member of the WTL, where she was elected to the New York branch's vice presidency in 1908. Now, she left the factory to work for the League and became an active participant in the uprising of the 20,000. This was a massive shirtwaist workers in New York City that was led by the International Lady Garment Workers Union in 1909. So when the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911 dramatized the conditions that Schneiderman and the WTAA and the union movement were fighting, she had already documented unsafe conditions throughout factories. In fact, many factories in New York were without fire escapes, or of course, many factories many times locked the exit doors to keep workers from either joining unions or from stealing materials. So at dozens of sweatshops in New York and the surrounding communities, Rose Schneiderman was there. 25 workers had died in a similar sweatshop fire in Newark, New Jersey, shortly before the Triangle disaster. Schneiderman expressed her anger at the memorial meeting that was held in the Metropolitan Opera House on April 2nd, 1911. And it was an audience that was largely made up of well-heeled members of the WTUL. So I want to give justice to a speech that she gave, and hope that I can give justice, to kind of give you the extent of Rose Schneiderman's involvement with organizing women. And these are her words. "I would be a traitor to these poor burned bodies if I came here to talk good fellowship." Now, this is a speech that she's giving concerning the deaths that occurred in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. "We have tried you, good people of the public, and we have found you wanting. The old Inquisition had its racks and its thumbscrews and its instruments of torture with iron teeth. We know what these things are today. The iron teeth are our necessities. The thumbscrews are the high-powered and swift machinery close to which we must work. And the rack here is in the fire trap structures that will destroy us the minute they catch on fire. This is not the first time girls have been burned alive in the city. Every week I must learn of the untimely death of one of my sister workers. Every year, thousands of us are maimed. The life of men and women is so cheap and property is so sacred. There are so many of us, for one job it matters little if 146 of us are burned to death. We have tried you, citizens. We are trying you now, and you have a couple of dollars for the sorrowing mothers, brothers, and sisters by way of a charity gift. But every time the workers come out in the only way they know to protest against conditions which are unbearable, the strong hand of the law is allowed to press down heavily upon us. Public officials have only words of warning to us, warning that we must be intensely peaceable, and they have the workhouse just back of all their warnings. The strong hand of the law beats us back when we rise into the conditions that make life unbearable. I can't talk fellowship to you who are gathered here. Too much blood has been spilled. I know from my experience it is up to the working people to save themselves. The only way they can save themselves is by a strong working class movement. And these are her words. And we can all learn from her words as we witness what is occurring today in movements, in the women's movements, and in the Fight for 15, as you see around you. Rose Schneiderman dedicated the rest of her life in the political arena on a platform that called for the construction of nonprofit housing for workers, improved neighborhood schools, publicly owned power utilities and staple food products, and state-funded health and unemployment insurance for all Americans. And this was her agenda. Schneiderman was a founding member of the American Civil Liberties Union, and she became friends with Eleanor and Franklin D. Roosevelt. And in 1933, she was the only woman to be appointed to the National Recovery Administration's Labor Advisory Board by President Roosevelt. And she was a member of Roosevelt's Brain Trust during that decade. And then from 1937 to 1944, she became Secretary of Labor for New York State. And she campaigned for the extension of Social Security to domestic workers and for equal pay for female workers. And during the late 1930s and early 1940s, she was involved in rescue efforts for European Jews, but she could only rescue a very small number. In fact, a notable scientist, Albert Einstein, wrote her, and he wrote, "It must be a source of deep gratification to you to be making so important a contribution to rescuing our persecuted fellow Jews from their calamitous peril and leading them to a better future." So that was Rose Schneiderman. Now, let's take a look at a textile workers' strike that occurred from January through March 1912 in Lawrence, Massachusetts. The strike was led primarily by immigrant women and their children who were tired of being abused and living in the rugged edge of poverty. About 25,000 workers went on strike. Now, Speak Out Now, which is a revolutionary workers group, informs readers that the people of Lawrence came from 51 different countries. More than 4/5 of them were born in countries other than the U.S. or were the children of immigrants. And they all spoke different languages. They all held different beliefs. They all came from different cultures, and they had different traditions. Now, during the strike, 25 translators were put into service as the women workers of Lawrence wanted interpretation because they were shouldering the double burden of working in the mills and caring for their families. And their struggle came to be known as the Bread and Roses Strike. It was named after a song that became associated with the strike, sung from the perspective of a woman worker. Now, Speak Out Now emphasizes that the Lawrence workers wanted higher wages and better working conditions and living conditions. But they also wanted access to education, culture, and free time to enjoy nature. Let's go to a film clip honoring their struggle.
At the turn of the century, America was rapidly becoming an industrial society. Nearly 30 million immigrants had risked the long trip to the New World with dreams of a better life. Many found their way to the textile mills of New England, where the opportunity was work with low wages, long hours, and dangerous working conditions. The factory system ushered in new demands for efficiency and control.
I regard my people just as I regard my machinery.
Discrimination in the mills was widespread. Recruiting wagons, known as slavers, sought out young women and children who they could pay half as much as men. A family industry, they called it.
I used to go to school, and then a man came by to my house and asked my father why I didn't go to work. The man said, "You give me $4 and I will make papers come from the old country which say she is 14. I went to work, and in about 2 weeks got hurt in my head. The machine pulled my scalp off. I was in the hospital 7 months.
1 out of every 3 mill workers died before the age of 25. Unions gained popularity among workers seeking better working conditions. The American Federation of Labor had won an 8-hour day for thousands of craft workers. But unskilled textile workers remained unorganized. In 1911, the Massachusetts State Legislature reduced the working week from 56 to 54 hours. Unwilling to let workers benefit, Lawrence's American Woolen Company, the world's largest textile plant, cut workers' wages. On January 12, 1912, when workers received their paychecks, cries of short pay rang throughout the mill. 14,000 workers poured into the streets.
Better to start fighting than to start working!
In 2 weeks, 25,000 workers from 11 mills had joined the strike. The city of Lawrence sounded a riot call. The workers had shut down the largest mills in the world. Mill owners kept their machines running, although no cloth was being woven, in an attempt to deceive the strikers. Carrying banners that read "Bread and Roses," the strikers expressed their demand for livable wages, bread, but also for dignity and respect, for roses in their lives. The Industrial Workers of the World, or Wobblies, sent nationally known labor leaders to organize the strike. They formed strike committees representing workers of 30 nationalities, held parades, and put up picket lines. Labeled anarchists, agitators, and fomenters of violence by the press, the strike leaders warned the unarmed workers not to resort to violence. Wobbly leader Bill Haywood.
They cannot weave cloth with bayonets. By all means, make this strike as peaceful as possible. All the blood spilled will be your blood.
Company guards sprayed workers in picket lines with freezing cold water from high-pressure hoses. The city of Lawrence called in the state militia, and on January 29th, police and troopers opened fire on a crowd of strikers, killing a young woman striker named Anna Lopeza. As resources diminished, the children of strikers were sent to stay with supporters in other cities. The children's pilgrimage drew national sympathy to the Lawrence strikers. The mill owners were outraged. On the morning of February 24th, 40 children gathered at the railroad station with their families. Without warning, club-wielding police attacked the parents and children. The nation reacted with horror.
Every right supposedly guaranteed under the Constitution has been ruthlessly taken from the industrial slaves of Lawrence.
I would rather never again wear a thread of woolen than know my garments had been woven at the cost of such misery as I have seen.
In response to national outrage, President Taft ordered an investigation. Many strikers, including a delegation of 16 children, testified before Congress about working conditions in the mills. With public support on their side, the strike committee made a final appeal. On March 12th, 3 months after workers had walked off their jobs, the American Woolen Company, speaking for all Lawrence mills, surrendered. 2 days later, 25,000 men, women, and children strikers gathered on the Lawrence Common and voted on the settlement. The workers had won wage increases, overtime pay, and rules against discrimination.
You have demonstrated the common interest of the working class. In bringing all nationalities together, you have won the most single victory of any body of organized workers in the world.
Though the victory was an example to textile workers in all of New England, the dream of one big union was short-lived. It would be another quarter of a century before industrial workers would form a union strong enough to win lasting gains.
Now, that Bread and Roses strike, there was a song that was written by James Oppenheim, and it was written in 1911, and it was used as part of the strike, the Bread and Roses. So I'm just going to read from you the verses in the song. I'm not going to try to sing it for you, but but I think the verses are very important because it shows the struggles that women were facing as they worked 12-hour days, 14-hour days, and then they had to go home to take care of their children. So the words go like this. As we come marching in the beauty of the day, 1,000,000 darkened kitchens, 1,000 mill lofts gray, are touched with all the radiance that a sudden sun discloses. For the people hear us singing, bread and roses, bread and roses. As we come marching, we battle too for men, for they are women's children, and we mother them again. Our lives shall not be sweated from birth until life closes. Hearts starve as well as bodies. Give us bread, but give us roses. As we come marching, unnumbered women dead, go crying through our singing their ancient song of bread. Small art and love and beauty, their drudging spirits knew. Yes, it is bread we fight for, but we fight for roses too. As we come marching, we bring the greater days. The rising of the women means the rising of the race. No more drudge and idler, tend the toil there where one reposes, but a sharing of life's glories. Bread and roses, bread and roses. So again, that's the significance of the strike by the women that brought the textile mills to a standstill. Now let's go to another woman that we must honor in this course, and she is known as Mary Harris Mother Jones. She was born in Cork, Ireland. She immigrated to this country, and she became a prominent American labor and community organizer. And she helped coordinate major strikes, and she co-founded the Industrial Workers of the World. She worked as a teacher and dressmaker, but after her husband and 4 children all died of yellow fever, and her workshop was destroyed in a fire in 1871, she began working as an organizer for the Knights of Labor and the United Mine Workers. And she was a very effective speaker. And she punctuated her speeches with stories. The audience would participate. There was humor. She had dramatic stunts. And from 1897, when she turned 60, she was known as Mother Jones. And in 1902, she was called the most dangerous woman in America for her success in organizing mine workers and their families against the mine owners. And in 1903, upset about the lack enforcement of the child labor laws in the Pennsylvania mines and silk mills, she organized a children's march from Philadelphia to the home of then-President Theodore Roosevelt in New York. And amidst the tragic and sometimes fatal violence directed at early trade unionists, Mother Jones uttered words that are still invoked by union supporters today. Pray for the dead and fight like hell for the living. So let's review a film clip on Mother Jones. She is filmed by a newspaper reporter on the occasion of her 100th birthday while living in Adelphi, Maryland in 1930. Now, this supposedly is the only known moving image and audio recording of the woman that was identified as the grand champion or grand old champion of labor. The footage was taken from a longer video produced to commemorate the dedication of Prince George County, Maryland school named for and dedicated to Mother Jones. So let's go to that film clip of her.
And I long to see the day when labor will have the destinies of the nation in her own hands, and that she will stand a united force and show the world what the workers can do.
Let's also, I'm going to sidetrack a bit, and we're going to listen to a song by a famous musician at the time, Gene Autry, who commemorated the death of Mother Jones. And so let's take a look and listen to Gene Autry singing the death of Mother Jones.
The world today's in mourning for the death of Mother Jones. Gloom and sorrow hover around the miner's home. This grand old champion of labor was known in every land. She fought for right and justice. She took an noble stand for the hills and through the valleys. In every mining town, Mother Jones was ready to help them. She never turned them down. On front with the striking miners, she always could be found and received a hearty welcome in every mining town. She was fearless of every danger. She hated that which was wrong. She never gave up fighting until her breath was gone. This noble leader of labor has gone to a better land, while the hard-working miners, they miss her guiding hand. May the miners all work together to carry out her plan and bring back better conditions for every laboring man.
Now, I chose that particular clip because it really caught me, because the man who published the clip, Edmond St. Austell, provided a very profound comment on Gene Autry singing it, and he just was so amazed by it. He writes that, now this might be called an exercise in cognitive dissonance. Gene Autry, the iconic singing cowboy and singer of seemingly endless Christmas songs for children, from Frosty the Snowman down to Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, singing a labor protest song to celebrate Mary Harris Mother Jones, the American labor organizer and co-founder of the Industrial Workers of the World. The generation who knew the realities of the Great Depression is disappearing along with World War II veterans. There was a different reality in this country back then, and the western and southern states had particularly hit. This song comes from a gritty reality not much remembered today. So that's Mary or Mother Jones. Now we're going to visit a very important strike, one of the most deadly incidents in the history of immigrant labor relations in the United States, and that is known as the Ludlow Massacre. The Ludlow Massacre resulted in the violent deaths of 19 people during an attack by the Colorado National Guard on the tent colony of 1,200 striking coal miners and their families at Ludlow, Colorado on April 20th, 1914. Now, the deaths had occurred after a day-long fight between strikers and the Guard. 2 women and 11 children are going to be asphyxiated and burned to death. And 3 Union leaders and 2 strikers were killed by gunfire, along with 1 child, 1 passerby, and 1 National Guardsman. And in response, the miners armed themselves and attacked dozens of mines, destroying property and engaging in several skirmishes with the Colorado National Guard. So the Ludlow Massacre refers to the violent deaths of 20 people, 11 of them children, during an attack by the Colorado National Guard on a tent colony of 1,200 striking coal miners and their families in Ludlow, Colorado on April 20th, 1914. Let's view a film clip where historians get together and talk about that massacre.
The miners would terrorize scabs and strike breakers. The National Guard and private detectives hired by the mine companies would in turn terrorize the miners. Private detectives from the Baldwin Felts Detective Company manufactured this armored car with a machine gun mounted on the back that they called the Death Special. And they would tear through these tent cities, firing the machine gun randomly, just to spark terror and fear among the miners and their families.
It would routinely circle the tent colony, spraying machine gun fire over the heads of the colonists. And searchlights were set up in the foothills above the colony, and light would be played on the tent colony at night. Anything to disrupt the daily rhythms of the workers.
As a result of all of this, most of the miners were keeping firearms. And in a tent city like Ludlow, many people dug a small cave underneath the tent. They would do that to store supplies, firearms to be sure, but it was also seen as an emergency shelter in case shooting really began.
There were stories told by the National Guardsmen about how well armed the strikers were. Our archaeology didn't really disclose weapons of mass destruction. Where are the WMDs? We ought to find ammunition caches and rifle pits, etc., etc. And I think by the time April rolled around, the company had about had it, because their profits were being eaten up, their men were being harassed.
What went wrong that would allow something like this to happen? On April 19th, 1914, the miners at Ludlow celebrated Greek Easter. And they did it with dancing and feasting and celebration, and they even had a baseball game with some of the National Guardsmen.
They sensed that this was going to be coming as well, because some comments had been made by militiamen about, you have your fun today and then we'll have our fun tomorrow. The colonists may have had a heads up that something was going to happen the next day, and in fact it did.
When tensions began to multiply on the morning of April 20th, Louis Tikas went to the National Guard to negotiate a truce. Instead, he was beaten. He was hit in the head with a rifle butt so hard that it broke the stock of the rifle.
This National Guard officer pulled out his revolver and shot him, killed him right on the spot.
The one person who's willing to make the first peaceful gesture is mistreated. And in this case, it enraged the strikers, who were more than ready to return fire on the National Guard.
There's some dispute about what happened on the morning of April 20th. A lot of historians believe that there was going to be a premeditated attack on the colony as a final effort to try to break the strike.
Before long, there's a running gun battle going on, with the strikers fleeing for their lives.
Almost immediately, it turned into a full-scale battle. The miners grabbed their rifles and hid along an arroyo, trying to draw the National Guard away from their families at the Ludlow tent colony. The National Guardsmen mounted a machine gun on top of a nearby hill and sprayed the miners in the camp somewhat randomly with machine gun fire.
One of the most important moments in the violence is when a train passes by. They're shooting each other from different sides of the railroad track. And so when a train passes by, it provides cover for people to escape.
The militiamen, qua mercenary soldiers, moved into the colony, set tents aflame.
Some 10 miners were killed, as well as one National Guardsman.
I'm not sure that they were intending to kill people. I think they just wanted to disperse the colonists and see if this would help in breaking the strike.
They went about systematically firing the camp to destroy it and destroy the miners' base.
Most of the colonists got out, except for these 13 people, these 11 children and 2 women who got caught in a tent cellar below a burning tent that collapsed on top of them, and they were suffocated. And that's when it hit the fan, really, and got national press.
There's terrible violence after the Ludlow Massacre. You get this 10-day war, which essentially begins when the miners take revenge against scab workers and company guards and anyone else they can find all over southern Colorado.
But in the aftermath of the massacre, miners took to their guns and they began attacking company towns and company mines throughout the southern Front Range, attacking towns like Forbes, driving out the scabs and the National Guardsmen there, throwing dynamite into the mines to blow them shut, burning buildings in the company towns, killing superintendents, killing National Guardsmen, killing strikebreakers especially. It was the bloodiest civil insurrection in American history since the Civil War.
When the colony was burning, people dispersed up into the Black Hills. People hightailed it to the houses of friends and neighbors that they might have known. They camped out up in the hills. Small groups of miners would organize and then basically do guerrilla warfare, try to strike back at the company, tear up railroad lines, burn company buildings, destroy property.
They ran the state militia out of the area. They ran the company guards out of the area, and they actually went into these towns and took over the mines. And they had control of mainly Los Animas County and Waterville County.
That culminates with President Wilson calling in the United States Army, and that's what puts an end to the violence and eventually the strike.
The strike technically was a failure, but it was a turning point.
We do have the meeting minutes from the period before and after Ludlow. Those minutes basically say no one attended and no business was conducted, and those minutes, they say the same thing for a period of about a year, 6 months before Ludlow and 6 months after.
The outcome of the Ludlow Massacre was kind of mixed. On the one hand, Ludlow became a rallying cry for laborers and labor unions throughout the country. Remember Ludlow became a slogan of labor radicalism in many respects. On the other hand, the reforms that came out of Ludlow were somewhat lukewarm. John D. Rockefeller Jr., who controlled Standard Oil and the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, hired a public relations expert to help him rehabilitate his image in the wake of the massacre.
I think definitely other companies throughout the country were watching CF&I's activities, a response to Ludlow. It was a lot of very negative publicity for the Rockefeller families.
John Rockefeller came out and visited the scene and talked to Mother Jones and talked to some of the families and talked to the women and got his company to implement what was called a company union.
Okay, so the Ludlow Massacre was a watershed moment in American labor relations. Historian Howard Zinn has described the Ludlow Massacre as the culminating act of perhaps the most violent struggle between corporate power and laboring men in American history. And Congress responded to the public outcry by directing the House Committee of Mines and Mining to investigate the incident. And its report, published in 1915, was very influential in promoting child labor laws and an 8-hour workday for miners. So this ends the part 2 of Socialism Influencing Progressive Reform.